Genshin Impact is not a very difficult game, but to a lot of newcomers, character building might be a little confusing as to how to go about it. As such, this video is a complete tutorial on how to roughly build any Genshin Impact character. This concise guide should serve as a basic tutorial for new and intermediate players alike who are unsure on the basics of character building. Before we start, I'd just like to direct you to twitch.tv/2kc, where I often stream Genshin Impact, so just drop by the stream sometime if you'd like. To begin, let's cover the various ways a character can be improved before we get into the meat of the content. For any character, the way you can make them stronger are your level and ascension stats, your weapon choice, your artifacts, and finally your talent levels. We will mainly be discussing artifacts in this video, as they are the main component with the most variables, but there's a very important note that a lot of players tend to ignore as well, and that is that artifacts are RNG. You could spend weeks or months farming an artifact domain and still be unable to improve the performance of your character. Increasing the character level, weapon levels, and talents on the other hand are always reassured upgrades. As such, I always recommend leveling the character and their weapons as high as possible first, as well as leveling the primary contributing talent, or talents, to above level 6 before starting to dedicate all your resin to farming artifacts for them. Before we get into the character archetypes and their builds, let's first go over the basics of artifacts quickly for those who are still unfamiliar with the artifact system. There are three important factors for artifacts: the artifact main stat, the substats, and the artifact set bonus or bonuses. For the main stats, the flower will always be flat HP, and the feather will always be flat attack. The sands, goblet, and circlet have various different main stats that are obtainable, which are all shown on the screen right now. Main stats are often the most important, as they affect the stats of your character the most. For substats, these are additional stats that can be obtained by leveling the artifact. At level 0, an artifact can have either 3 or 4 substats. We often refer to this as a 3 or 4 liner respectively. Every 4 levels an artifact obtains, the artifact will get 1 substat roll. The substat distribution will be thrown up on the screen right here for you to refer to. 4 liners are generally more desired, as they basically give you 1 free substats worth of stats, but please keep in mind that this is only important if you already have decent artifacts to begin with, as having a 4-liner doesn't necessarily mean that the artifact will be better than a 3-liner, since the substat rolls are complete RNG. In general, substats are there to balance out your character's stats, and is often what makes or breaks a good artifact. Finally, we have the set bonus or bonuses. Artifact 2 and 4-piece bonuses offer a ton of utility, and are sometimes specially tailored for specific characters, like in the case of Viridescent Venera for most animal characters, or Emblem of Severed Fate for burst and energy recharge dependent characters. That being said, depending on the character, the set bonus may not be worth forcing if you cannot get good substats and main stats on the artifacts. In most cases, try to prioritize your main stats, then the substats or set bonus, as these two are interchangeable depending on which affects the character more. Substats and set bonuses are things you can eventually farm and build towards. There are exceptions to this rule, but most characters can generally follow this. Moving on to how to actually build a character. Let's first segregate the characters in Genshin Impact to 3 different archetypes. We have main DPS, sub DPS, and support. Some people might ask why I'm separating sub DPS and support, and this is because while all sub DPSs can be considered supports, not all supports are sub DPSs. There are plenty of supports in this game whose builds can completely ignore damage for them to do their job. Also, I'll be going over general build paths for each of these, and thus will ignore talking about specific artifact set bonuses. Please look up what the optimal sets each character would use when character building. Let's first discuss a standard run-of-the-mill main DPS artifact build, first covering the artifact main stats. Your sands should be whatever the character scales off the most for damage, your goblet should be a damage bonus to whatever elemental type your character deals, and your circlet should generally be crit rate or crit damage, depending on how balanced your stats are. In regards to the sands, this can sometimes vary a lot depending on the character's utility as well. For example, Raiden Shogun and her optimal artifact set both scale off energy recharge, which incentivizes running an ER Sans. However, without her weapon, the Engulfing Lightning, an attack Sans can often outperform an ER one just based on pure damage. Similarly, Yelan would generally prefer an HP Sans for damage since she scales off HP, but if you do not have enough energy recharge, it would be better to run an energy recharge Sans since her burst uptime is more important in most scenarios. So just use whatever you feel is more optimal for damage in your team. Moving on to the goblet, for those wondering about an attack goblet compared to an elemental one, you should almost always go for an elemental one since an elemental goblet is a damage multiplier, and attack buffs can be often obtained from external sources such as Bennett's ult or Sara's E, making attack goblets have more diminishing returns if you use them. There are, however, several exceptions where an attack goblet can be favoured. One example is my Mona. Her attack is fairly low, and she already gets some hydro damage scaling off her energy recharge. As such, it was more beneficial for me to run an attack goblet on her instead of a hydro damage goblet one. Similarly, my C6 Kazuha build would have very low attack if I went with an animal goblet, and he already gets so much bonus damage from his elemental mastery as well as his weapon that getting more elemental damage bonus from the goblet just isn't worth it. Finally, the only other situation where I would use an attack goblet is if you have an attack goblet that has incredibly good substats and your elemental goblet just doesn't have good substats. In that situation, it might be okay to run an attack goblet if you think it does more damage. Just do some damage testing on your own to see which one works out better for you. Substat priority for main DPSs generally goes in this order: crit rate or crit damage, energy recharge if they are burst dependent for most of their damage, elemental mastery if they are reaction proc based, and finally, whatever the character scales the most off of for damage, such as HP percent or attack percent. Final thing to mention, I always recommend at least 60% crit rate for DPSs, and ideally over 70% crit rate for main DPSs in particular. Crit rate is especially important for consistency and is often the most overlooked part of people's builds, as crit is a very difficult stat to obtain. However, the reason why crit rate is so important is because if you focus all on your attack or crit damage, etc., but neglect your crit rate, the moment you do not crit, you lose more than half your damage, and thus resulting in massive DPS losses. It is better to have high crit rate and low crit damage than low crit rate but high crit damage. For sub DPSs, the build path is very similar to a main DPS one, but can differ slightly depending on the character. Usually, there are goblets and circlets which use an elemental and crit one respectively, no different from a main DPS. However, the sans can often vary. For example, for a character like Xiangling, while an attack sans will offer her more damage, her primary use is for her off-field burst, making burst uptime the most important thing in her kit, and thus an energy recharge sans is generally more beneficial to her than an attack one. For Zhongli, an attack sans is better for his meteor damage, but that takes a huge hit on his shield strength, and thus I always recommend an HP sans since it gives respectable damage and greatly improves shield strength. Sacrificing damage for more utility is generally the name of the game for many sub DPSs. Substat priority would follow the exact same thing as main DPSs. For sub DPSs, I would also be more forgiving of artifact standards since they do not make up the majority of your team's damage. I would target around 50 to 60% crit rate at minimum, but just like main DPSs, I would try to bump this up to over 70% once you get better artifacts and start to move further into the endgame. For supports, this is where the build path differs the most. For example, if you use Bennett only for his healing and attack buff, you can go energy recharge on the Sans, HP on the Goblet, as well as healing bonus on the Circlet, which I actually do not have one of those. This is assuming of course that you do not care about Bennett's damage completely. Another example would be Kazuha. Kazuha is a character who focuses on giving buffs based on his elemental mastery, and thus is usually only built with elemental mastery as the main stat on all three of his artifacts. Basically, for pure supports whose focus isn't damage, just focus on the stats that would benefit the team the most based on their kits. So that covers it for artifacts. But what about weapons? In general, weapons with crit as a substat is very much favoured over other stats for DPSs. This is because crit is a very hard stat to obtain in artifacts, so having it be balanced by the weapon is often quite valuable. However, I generally only recommend extremely strong DPS oriented weapons for main DPS type characters, as they push their damage even further beyond. Especially if you're lacking in a lot of crit weapons, try to reserve them for your main damaging characters. On the other hand, just like artifacts, sub DPSs can instead trade their damage for utility. One of the best examples is having a Favonius or sacrificial weapon on a sub DPS. Sub DPSs still need to build crit, and the Favonius gives a good amount of energy to all party members when the said character crits, making this a lower damage but extremely strong team utility weapon. On my main account, my Zhongli is built as a DPS, so he has been built with more crit and a more damage oriented weapon. On my free to play account, my Zhongli is not as focused on damage, and serves a more sub DPS / supportive role instead, and so he carries a Favonius Lance to aid his team's energy. And finally, for pure supports, the only things you have to look out for in weapons are the weapon substat or passive. Weapons like the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers can make any Catalyst user an attack buffer thanks to its passive, and Favonius or sacrificial weapons provide a ton of energy recharge to the character if they are burst dependent and don't take up a lot of field time to funnel energy into them. Weapons are more flexible and less tied to a character's archetype than artifacts are, especially since there are so many weapons that can fill in different purposes. So just see which weapon's main stat or passive fits your character the best. And there you go, a general idea on how to build practically any character in Genshin Impact. Very few characters deviate from the standard artifact main stat options in terms of build, so you should roughly know how to adjust moving forward just by looking at the character's kit. As a summary, these are the things to remember. For main DPSs, the sands should be whatever the character scales off the most for damage, in most cases, attack. The goblet should be elemental damage bonus, and the circlet should generally be crit. Sub DPSs usually follow the same build path, with the exception being that the sands can be changed to something more utility oriented rather than damage oriented. Pure supports vary the most heavily for artifacts, so just explore what benefits your team the most. Finally, I'd like to clarify that while there is no right or wrong way to play the game and build a character, there are objectively better or worse builds if you try and plan to play optimally. As such, I highly recommend watching or reading character-specific guides if you want to find out how to build a specific character. I will link some Genshin guide makers below, and don't forget that I also make guides, so subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Don't forget that I also stream over on Twitch at twitch.tv/DukeKC every so often, so go catch a stream sometime if you haven't already. Anyways, that's all I have for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Take care.